My name is Keith. I'm lead pastor here at Resonate, and it is incredibly good to be with you here tonight, and also for you guys at Central and you guys at Eastern, as you guys join us by video. Man, so good to have you guys with us as well. As Drew said, we're getting into the series called Live Sent, and this is something that we've been planning, thinking about for about 6 months, and so I really believe that God is going to do some really big things in the next 3 weeks in our church. And as I begin to think through this, and as I begin to kind of process this, and really what we're talking about, there's a moment in my life that really came back, and I was really reminded of this week when I began to prepare for this. And so really that moment is kind of a crazy moment, but a few years ago, I was asleep in my bed, and I was asleep in bed, and I began to wake up. And you guys have done this before, like in the middle of the night, you'll wake up. But this night was really different for me. I woke up and I couldn't figure out where I was. I couldn't figure out what was going on. I had no recollection of where I was actually at. And that wasn't the worst thing. The worst thing was I couldn't figure out who was in the bed with me. And it was just like this mind-blowing moment, right? And I'm sitting here, I'm saying, where am I? And who is this girl beside me? And again, I began to think through and trying to process through and try to have, how did I get here? And all I could recall was pizza, and then it got all blurry. And so I couldn't figure out how I was here and what brought me to this place. And so I'm there, and all of a sudden I begin to panic, and I begin to think, this is not good. This is really, really bad. I'm in seminary. I'm in ministry, and I begin to kind of put together, and I was like, how did this happen? How did this work out this way? And so I began to okay, so damage control. What do I do? What do I do? What do I do? And so I thought, okay, I'm going to slip out of bed, and I'm going to try to go really slowly so I don't wake up Miss What's-Her-Name. And so I did that. I got out of bed. She didn't wake up. And I began I realized right at that moment that I didn't have any pants on. And this is normal because I typically don't go to sleep with pants on. But as I began to realize, I began to look around and said, okay, I need to figure out where my pants are. And I could not find them at all. Like I looked around and I began to kind of get to this moment. It was like, I can't find my pants. Like, what am I going to do? And so I began to kind of play out this whole scenario in my mind about what was going on. And I began to realize that I'm just going to have to leave. I'm going to have to go Walter White on this, right? I'm just going to have to leave without pants. And I began to kind of put together, I was like, okay, so I don't know how I got here. So that means I don't know if I have a car here, but that really doesn't matter because the keys to the car most likely are in the pants that I do not have on right now. So I'm trying to figure out how am I going to put this all together and what is going to happen in this. What's going to happen is I begin to leave this house and I begin to walk down the street and I don't have pants on. I begin to formulate in my mind what is going to happen. How am I going to answer the cop that says, son, why are you walking down the street without any pants on at this time at night, right? So I'm trying to figure out all of this. And so this comes to a head in the moment that I reach for the doorknob and I open the door. And what happens makes my heart absolutely stop as I take the bedroom door and I open it into the hall. This is a crazy moment because what happens is I recognize the hall. Like I recognize the hall. And all of a sudden it becomes very clear to me, this is my house. This is my house, right? And I look back at the bed and I was like, and that is my wife. That is my wife. And it's like the panic subsides and I feel so blessed and overwhelmed. And I'm just like celebrating inside because I don't have to leave the house without any pants on. And this is like this huge moment. I realize I'm at 2418 East 25th Street in Vancouver, Washington. Yeah, shout out to Vancouver there. And I turn back around and I began to realize, okay, now I know where I'm at. And I get back in bed, and as I get back in bed, I'm just kind of, I'm amped. I'm feeling it, right? Excited that this turned out this way, right? And my wife, Paige, wakes up, and she's like, what's going on? So I told her, I was like, I totally didn't know where I was at, and I didn't know who you were, and I tried to slip out of the bed, and she's like, hold it. Are you telling me that you were just gonna bail on that girl? And I said, you're that girl. She said, you said you were gonna bail on me? I was like, where's this going? This is not going anywhere good. I was like, no, let me be clear. And she's like, she's all mad, right? And so we kind of have a disagreement there. I was like, this is all hypothetical. This is not real. This is crazy, crazy moment, right? And you might be thinking, I'm a little worried about you, Keith, like that you're like having these moments where you're like, oh, I can't believe what happened there. But let me give you a little bit of context. See, before that moment, about a month before that, I'd gotten married, and then we'd gone on our honeymoon and packed up all our things, and we'd been in the house for about 2 weeks. So cut me a little slack there, right? 2 weeks. I'd been married a month. I'd been in this house for 2 weeks, moved from Texas all the way here. And in this, I had this moment where I couldn't figure out the context. And I tell you this whole story, and I tell you all of this, and this is why it's relevant to this. Because in that moment, there's a panic when I couldn't figure out the context of my life, when I couldn't figure out what was going on all around me. And in this, here's where we begin to push into this series. I believe that God, in this next few weeks, is going to help us to understand the context of our lives. And in much the same way as I open the door, and as I begin to open the door, I begin to realize the context. I believe that God is going to open some doors into our lives, and we're going to be able to see, as we begin to kind of have a new reality painted before us, what the actual context of our lives are going to be. And this is what I've been praying, that for some of you, this is a moment where you're going to walk through that door, and this is going to be a new you. This is going to be a new reality that you begin to kind of understand the context of your life. And really, this is why this matters. Because when we understand that, when we begin to get that, and we're not just talking about sleepwalking and forgetting where you are, we're talking really about the kind of life that you're living. Every one of us, we're asking this question, what am I doing here? Or maybe more specifically, what on earth am I here for? And relating back to that idea of what's my purpose? And when we begin to think about lives that we want to live, I really think that this is a profound thing as we begin to ask this question, what's the point of it all? And why should I live my life in this way? And is this all there is in life? Some of the stories that capture our lives, capture our attention, capture our imagination, are the stories of the superhero that all of a sudden recognizes their purpose in life. Kind of everything gets clear in who they are and why they're here. Or stories like the Chronicles of Narnia or the Lord of the Rings, where all of a sudden we're just living these normal lives and the door opens and there's an adventure on the other side of that. There's something that becomes very clear to us that is unseen, and we're just kind of living our normal lives, and then all of a sudden we begin to live towards a bigger story, and we begin to understand our purpose, and that begins to radically change our story. And if this is you, if you're saying, you know what, I'd love to find out a little more clarity about what my purpose on earth is for, then you're in the right place. And I want to introduce to you tonight, today, a guy by the name of Solomon, a guy named King Solomon. And it's going to be helpful for us as we begin to figure out what the context of life is and what's the purpose and what am I here for. King Solomon was a guy who was the third king of Israel, lived about 3,000 years ago, was the son of King David, very famous King David. This is one of his sons. And in this, he rises to the place of being king over Israel. And in this, there's a really unique thing that happens because one night in a dream, God asked him, what does he want? In fact, let's go to the scripture. If you want to turn with me to Kings, what we see is this. In 1 Kings chapter 5, or chapter 3, verse 5, it says this, at Gibeon, the Lord appeared to Solomon during the night in a dream, and God said, ask for whatever you want me to give you. Ask for whatever you want me to give you. And this is how Solomon replies. He says this in verse 9. It says, so give your servant a discerning heart to govern your people and to distinguish between right and wrong. For who is able to govern this great people of yours? The Lord was pleased that Solomon had asked this. So God said to him, since you have asked for this, and not for a long life or wealth for yourself, nor have you asked for the death of your enemies, but for discernment in administering justice, I will do what you have asked. I will give you a wise and discerning heart, so that there will never have been anyone like you, nor will there ever be. Basically, he's saying, okay, Solomon, if your one request is for wisdom, then I'm going to give you an amount of wisdom. I'm going to give you a measure of wisdom that is beyond any who have ever lived and any who will live from here till now. That includes us in this context. And so here's Solomon. He goes, and from that moment on, he begins to preside over this kingdom. And what happens is he becomes an extraordinary king. In fact, as we begin to see the story of King Solomon, he amasses more wealth in that day and age than anyone has in a comparative sense up to then and from then till now. It's an amazing amount of wealth. It's kind of this mind-blowing amount of wealth that he assembles. Not only that, is he becomes the most powerful man in the region. He's wealthy. He is powerful. What happens is he begins to build buildings. He builds the temple. So he takes and it is this amazing building to be able to have the place to house the Ark of the Covenant. He built God's house. He's an architect. He's a scientist. He's a guy who everyone comes. It says that all these nations, people would come to have an audience with King Solomon because he was so wise. This is what Solomon was about. He was a guy who was well known for his wisdom more than anyone else. But there was a dark side to Solomon too. You see, Solomon wanted to experience everything. He wanted to have all of these massive experiences in his life because he needed to figure out what life is about. And so we see Solomon not only have these great parts about him, but these really dark sides about him too, these really sinful sides. You see, Solomon, he collected 700 wives. Not only that, the Bible says he collected 300 concubines, right? I don't even know how to fathom that, right? I'm sure that there's something that's snarky to say right there, but that's a lot of people, right? 1,000 women that he has collected in this. It talked about his parties that would go on for 40 days and incredible expenses. And he would begin to try to figure out what is it that we need to figure out from life. And so he goes through all of this, both incredibly powerful, amazing thing, God bless thing, these very sinful things. But what happens is he begins to live his life, and as he begins to get to the end of life, having have had all these experiences, try to figure out what is it that makes life satisfying. He writes this book called Ecclesiastes. Ecclesiastes is an incredible book, and tonight I want to walk us through the entire book. I want to preach the entire book, and you might say, okay, how long are we going to take that? I'm not going to read the entire book, but I'm going to preach it because Ecclesiastes is this unique book that you need to read from the beginning to the end in one setting. If you take and chop Ecclesiastes up into pieces and don't finish it, it's going to be really depressing, right? Because if you don't understand the context of all of this, you don't get its brilliance. You don't understand why this guy was the wisest guy. He just sounds like a sniveling, cynical dude, right? But when we begin to put this all together, what it does is from the lens that Solomon, the wisest man, the most experienced man who has ever lived on this earth, begins to crack open something that helps us to understand the context for our lives and help us to understand why, what on earth are we here for. So we're going to dive into this. And I want to caution you, it's going to get really dark and it's going to get really difficult, but just hang with me, because this is all a part of helping us to understand the truth of our lives. So we're going to be in Ecclesiastes, and we're going to start off right where he starts off in the very beginning. First chapter, first verse. What he does is he gives us his thesis statement. He wants to make sure you get this point, because it's not likely that you're going to finish this book after this first two or three verses, right? You're going to put this away and say, man, give me something give me some Psalms, give me some good news, right? Give me something that's more helpful than this. And here's what he has to say. Chapter 1, verse 1 is what it says. The words of the teacher, son of David, king in Jerusalem. You ready? Meaningless, says the teacher. Utterly meaningless. Everything is meaningless. All right. Aren't you glad you came to church tonight, right? Here we are. Let's talk about life. It's meaningless, says the Bible. Like, what are we here for, right? This is this crazy thing as he begins to unpack and says, I want you to get what's going on. I want you to understand the context for all of it. And he starts off with meaningless, so it seems like it's like at the very far end of the spectrum of the emotions that we could be feeling, but he presses us even further. He goes on and says this in verse 3. He says, what do people gain from all their labors at which they toil under the sun? Basically, he's saying all this, he's asking the question, but it's a rhetorical question, because in this, as you begin to read, he begins to say to us, do you realize that all the things that we are working for are utterly futile? That when we begin to think through all the things that we are trying to build up for ourselves, it is something that ultimately leaves us without anything. And he begins to talk through what does this look like? So what do? We collect this stuff. Why do we collect this stuff? So we can have stuff, so we can use stuff. Then we use stuff, and stuff wears out. And then what do? We trade it. We get rid of it, right? And so we can buy more stuff, new stuff, and then we use it. And then it gets old, and we replace it with new stuff, right? And so this cyclical kind of idea keeps going, and then you die, and someone else gets your stuff, right? And they wonder, why did he have all this stuff, right? This stuff is useless to me. And what are they going to do with their stuff, right? And so it happens over and over and over. When we begin to think about this, what happens? Then he presses us even further. Not only is we talking about this meaningless stuff, and the stuff that we collect isn't the stuff that's ultimately going to lead us into some kind of meaningful existence, but he goes on, verse 4, he says this, generations come and generations go, but the earth remains forever. And now he's just getting unkind, right? He's just pressing us to say, do you realize that you're just a part of something that gets replaced over and over and over? And maybe we don't think about this. Maybe you don't fully understand what Solomon is going to communicate. So I want to do a little exercise for us. I want us to take, and if you can tell all of the names, first and last, of your grandparents, if you know all of the names of your grandparents, first and last, I want you to raise your hand. All right, raise your hand. You know all the names of your grandparents. Okay, that's good. All right, here's what, keep your hands up if you know that. Okay, I want to ask you now, if you can name all of your great-grandparents' first and last name, keep your hand up. Keep your hand up. All right, there's like five in here, right, that we see. Let's go one more. If you could name all of the names of your great-great-grandparents' first and last name. It's like 1, 2. Here's this reality. When we begin to kind of ask this question, when we begin to kind of press into this, are you telling me that really within 2 to 3 generations, that even your family won't even remember your name? That even your family won't remember your name? That's kind of crazy, right? When we begin to think about our lives and doing something significant and all this stuff, but to realize what Solomon is saying, that in 2 to 3 generations, your family won't even remember your name. He presses into this. He thinks, if we think we're special, he's kind of setting us in our place. Let's keep going. Verse 5, the sun rises and the sun sets, and it hurries back to where it rises, right? What he's saying is like, your life is going to go on, and you're kind of going to progress through life. And then one day, each and every one of us is coming for everybody in this room. We're going to die. And what's going to happen on the other day, the day after we die? The sun is going to rise, and the sun is going to set. It happens over and over and over. Verse 9, we go a little bit further, and it says this, what has been will be again. What has been done will be done again. There is nothing new under the sun. Okay, so we begin to say, okay, the stuff, man, maybe it's the stuff that gives us meaning. Okay, not the stuff. Maybe it's like our generational lineage and being remembered by our family. Maybe that's the thing, not so much. Maybe it's all these different things when we begin to think about how hard we work or being able to master all these things. It said it's all been done before, right? All these things, you're just like, if I can just accomplish this, then I'll make a name for myself. If I can just do this, he said, it's all been done before. Bit by bit, Solomon is working through all these things that we put our significance in, we put our hope in, and he's kind of chopping them off. And he says, if you think that you're doing something special, you realize you're just a modern version of what has happened before. Again, really difficult. And let me press one step further. Verse 11, it says this. He said, I've seen something else under the sun. The race is not to the swift, nor the battle to the strong, nor does food come from the wise, or wealth to the brilliant, or favor to the learned, but time and chance happens to them all. Here's what he's saying. All the things that we have built up as expectations that we might have in our life, if we were saying, I'm going to rise to the top in this business, in this sporting area, I'm going to just have all this stuff that I put around me to fulfill my desires. I'm going to make a lasting legacy and a mark with my life. All these things that we might build up, he said, here's the reality. Time and chance is what you can rely on. And I know this is really dark, right? This is hard when we hear Solomon, the wisest guy in the world, say, you know what? If you have said, hey, here's my expectations in my life, I want you to know I have friends that have done all these things to build up for them financial security, and it's been ripped out from under it. I have friends who did everything right, lived righteous lives, and their wives left them. If we begin to think, hey, there's an equation in life, and if I do this, then this is the hope, this is the expectation I get out of it. Here is what Solomon is saying. That's not how it works. That's not how, we can't put this thing in a box. And I know some of you, especially if you're younger here, you're just saying, why does the Bible say this? This is so depressing. Why did I come to church? I don't even know if I like Resonate anymore, right? In this whole thing, as we begin to think about this, we begin to press back and we begin to say, I don't think that that's really the way it is. I don't think that that's the way that life is going to go for me. I have hope in something better. And throughout the book of Ecclesiastes, what Solomon does is he says, almost in a mocking kind of way, do you think you have more wealth than I have? That somehow if you just are able to have enough wealth and that can save you? Do you think that somehow if you build up enough power that you will be able to find significance in that kind of way? Do you think that somehow that you can fill your life with all the desires of your heart? Do you think you do that more than I've done that? Do you think that in terms of your relationships and the amount of sex that you can have, that that's more than what I've experienced in my life? He's almost chiding us to say, really, do you think that you have done more than I have done? And we look, we have to understand. He says, go ahead, try to prove me wrong. Try to squeeze some meaning out of this life. And it gets really bleak sounding. Until you realize that woven into this book is a key that breaks this thing wide open. Woven into this is a phrase that when you begin to understand the phrase here, it begins to help clarify all the brilliance that is Solomon. When we begin to look closely at this book, what Solomon is whispering between the lines, what Solomon is trying to help us understand is found in this little phrase, under the sun. 29 times he uses the phrase, under the sun. And what happens is what he begins to do is help us to understand that there's a massive dichotomy, that there is two different worlds, that there's two different stories. There's the story of life that is under the sun, and there's the story of life that is beyond the sun. And when we begin to see him characterize all this stuff, he's like, meaningless. Life under the sun is meaningless. When we begin to find all of this, he says, here's what I found, all these things, that under the sun, here's how it works out. Here, under the sun, you're left to chance and futility. Under the sun, when you begin to play it out, you're forgotten 2 or 3 generations later. Under the sun, all your toil ends up always coming back to the same reality. And this is this thing as we begin to understand over and over, he begins to break it over with this simple little phrase, under the sun. And so the question is, if he begins to describe what life is under the sun, is there something more? And here is where it begins to get hopeful for us, because what Solomon does is he points to something that's beyond just this under the sun kind of life. He says in verse 11 of chapter 3, it says, he's talking about God here, he has made everything beautiful in its time. He's like, there's these moments that we stumble upon something that is beautiful. And it doesn't point to the futile, meaningless life that's here in front of us. It points to something better. It points to something bigger. We begin to see that there maybe is a bigger context. He says this, as we look in verse 11, not only this, he says, but he has set eternity in the human heart. It has also set eternity in the human heart. Not only is there moments where God begins to reveal that there's something that is beyond this, that there's this beautiful moment that points us to something greater, but in your heart, and you as humanity, because this is pervasive. This is not theology. This is not science. This is every culture. The majority of every culture that has ever lived has had something that pointed them to something bigger. Now, this is not just me speaking as a pastor here, right? This is a sociological reality that the majority of all humans that live, the vast majority of all humans live, that believe that there is something that is bigger than them, believe in a spirituality. And this is as we begin to get, in a place of being more intellectual, this is held constant. Over the last 50 years, as they've done longitudinal studies, they say, hey, people aren't believing in God anymore. It's gone from 94% to 92%, right? Still within the margin of errors within their studies. This is a part of the thing that is descriptive of what God has done, that he has set eternity in our hearts. And we can deny it. We can say, I don't like church, or I don't like this. I don't believe. Here's the thing. We always come back to these moments where we say, this is what I believe, that there's something that is bigger. And this is because God has set eternity in our hearts. It won't go away. He says this as well. He goes on and says, yet no one can fathom what God is doing from the beginning to the end. Solomon, I need you to get this, right? He's helping us to see meaningless. All of this under the sun is meaningless. All this toil, all these generations. Here's the reality. If you don't get that there is something that is beyond the sun that has been placed into your heart, into my heart, then the context of your life will always be jacked up. The context of our lives will always be messed up. But when we can begin to understand that there is something bigger and we begin to actually live our lives towards that, it completely revolutionizes the question, or the answer to the question, what on earth am I here for? And so in this, I need you to get, he's saying life under the sun is cyclical. And we get that, right? We sleep, we awake, we eat, we go to work, we come home, we watch Netflix, we go to bed, we wake up, we eat, we go to work, we take a shower in there somewhere, maybe not at work, but I left that out. So in this, we begin to understand that this happens over and over and over. And for some of you, you're out of college and you realize just how cyclical this world is, that is common for you. And you recognize that this is upon us. And in that cyclical life, over and over, this is what Solomon's saying, do you realize that what we think is like profound, like is just happening over and over? And there's a minute in your life, there's a place in your life where you begin to recognize, you know what? Just doing the same thing over and over. This is meaningless because I thought that thing, and I thought and I thought that job and that career was going to be the thing, but then it's not the thing, and I realized that my hope was put in that, and now I have to do something different. I'm trying to figure out what that is, and so now I have to go to another thing, and another thing, and another thing, and now this is getting into this place where I don't know what to do. Get in this place where, this is midlife crisis, right? This is when you go get a Miata and hair plugs. And you begin to think, this is the thing, right? Because I've walked through all these things over and over. That was actually kind of funny, guys. Miata and hair plugs. Anyway, so in this, here's what he says. He said, verse 14, I know that in everything Everything God does will endure forever. Nothing can be added to it, nothing taken away from it. God does it so that people will fear him, so that somehow someone's saying, hey, open the closet door, open the wardrobe door, because on the other side of it is not the cycle anymore. On the other side of it is a linear story. On the other side of it, there's something that is happening that is a part of a story. And in that story is the meaning behind life that you are looking for, the purpose of life. So you have two options: live the cycle or live the story. And God is doing something. And what God is doing is from the beginning to the end. That means it's going somewhere. That means there's something that we can be a part of that's not just meaningless over and over spinning our wheels. This is what he's inviting us into. See, when we begin to understand this, there becomes this moment where you realize there's a difference in significance and success. And this became so clear to me. Just a few weeks ago, one of my uncles died. He was working out in his yard, had a heart attack. Called the ambulance and they worked on him. But ultimately, by the end of the day, he died. Tragic. In his 50s. Avid golfer, right? Fit guy. So fly down to his funeral. And there, as we begin to talk about his life there in that funeral, in that service, see, the reality is he was a businessman that had multiple careers, was a really, really good golfer, was a guy who had all these things that were successful in his life. But in that moment, none of those things took precedent. In that moment, none of those things were what we talked about. There were things like him pointing his life towards going to the nations. His life pointed to his kids and what he did for the people around him. These were significant things. What he did for eternity was what was celebrated in this. Over and over. Here's the thing. We need to understand we can be successful, but ultimately insignificant. And somehow we've messed this up. And somehow we haven't figured out that success can be found under the sun, but significance only comes by living beyond it. I want you to get that success can be found under the sun, but significance only comes by living beyond it. That we can be really successful in the cycle, but if we're to be part of the story beyond the sun, this is what leads us to significance in our lives. This is a powerful, powerful thing. And here's what Solomon says. He says, I've lived this entire life. I've done all this stuff. I've put all of this into the context of my life, and here's what I need you to hear. This is the very ending of the book. This is why you need to read the entire book in one setting, because this is the linchpin to all the stuff that he said. Chapter 12, verse 13, it says this. Now that all has been heard, I've experienced everything, he says. I know it all. Now that all has been heard, here is the conclusion of the matter to the purpose of our lives under the sun. Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the duty of all mankind. Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the duty of all mankind. And this is powerful when we begin to see this. And we begin to understand the guy who has done it all, the guy who experienced it all, he comes back at the end of his life and says, let me give you some clarity in what this means. There's two ways to live. There's under the sun kind of ways to live. And Solomon begins to help us understand that there's all these things that we can point our lives at. And there's all these things that we can say, maybe she'll be the person, or he'll be the person, or maybe this job or this career, or if I get these things or enough money to have security so I don't have to rely upon anything else, maybe that's the thing that will ultimately provide for my happiness and give me meaning in life. And he says, you can search and you can do it and do all these things, but I promise you, they are not going to fulfill you. See, Solomon's saying, I want to keep you from the redo. Because there's many people who get to a certain age in their life and they begin to realize this principle and they wish they had the last 20 years back. They wish they had the last 50 years of their life back, and they wish they could go back and redo it. And here's what, as your pastor, I want to do. For many of you, you're young, and I want to save you the redo. I want you to be able to say, I'm going to trust in Solomon and not the wisdom of my culture, and be able to say, I'm going to go this way. I'm going to live my life not under the sun, but looking beyond the sun. See, this is Solomon's redo book. This is Solomon looking back and say, the wisest guy, here's what I realized. I did all this stuff, but at the end of it, I began to realize that this is not what I've been created for. And maybe it's this, guys, that when we begin to say, follow our hearts, that we're not asking the question deep enough. That we're following our hearts right, all right, but we're not pressing deep enough into that question and saying, what does our heart really desire? C.S. Lewis says it like this. He says, if I have found a desire within myself that no experience in this world can satisfy, the most probable explanation is that I was made for another world. It's just brilliant. When we begin to realize, and here's, I want to accelerate that moment when you have this realize that none of these things can actually satisfy me, can give me meaning in life. Maybe you're created for something else. So here's what he does. He writes the Chronicles of Narnia, and what he says in that, open the wardroom door, because on the other side of that is a story that you want to be a part of. And he's trying to say, this is what we should do with our lives. That we should say, on the other side of the sun, there's a story that you want to be a part of. There's something that will capture your life. There's something that's bigger. It's a linear story. It's not a cyclical story. What does it look like to be able to live our lives? And why should we be able to live our lives beyond the sun? Let me give you 3 reasons that I believe that you should live your life beyond the sun. Number 1, as living life beyond the sun gives a why to everything that you do. See, for us, we're going to be talking in the next couple of weeks. We're going to really, maybe you're thinking, hey, this is really big, Keith. This is like this 100,000-foot idea that I'm not exactly sure what I do with on Monday. And I promise you, over the course of this, our time together, we're going to get to the what of your life. But today is about the why. Today is about understanding that beyond the sun gives the context to your life so that you can answer the why. Because you can always answer the what if you know the why. That is what gives you clarity in your life. And so this is this reality when we begin to say, this gives meaning to everything that you do. When you begin to live beyond the sun, it gives meaning to everything that you do. Number 2, it removes the fear of death. It removes the fear of death. See, I think they're all so afraid of death because at our core, we don't know if we've actually lived a meaningful life. And so when it comes to this finality piece to it, we don't know if we've actually lived a meaningful life, and so it scares us to death. But here's what happens when we begin to understand a life beyond the sun. We begin to say, okay, I don't have to fear death. And if there's anything that I can help, I want to help you to be given, is something that removes the fear of death, because that removes anyone's leverage over you at all in your life. This is the secret to happiness, to be able to understand that if there's no threat for you, there's no way for you to ever live in fear. It's a beautiful, beautiful thing. Number 3, it allows you to answer the question, what is God's will for my life? See, when you begin to point over the sun and you begin to ask career questions, it begins to really simplify. It begins to really clarify. It allows you to begin to, and I would challenge you, if you're saying, I don't know what to do, begin to just ask God, help me. I want to live my life beyond the sun. Help me to know how to do that with my career choice. I promise you that God is going to meet you in that place. God is going to clarify, here's what this looks like. This is not necessarily going to ministry. There's all kinds of things that you can be doing in your life that's helping you to live life beyond the sun. Not only that, if you're trying to figure out, okay, who should I date? Who should I marry? See, our world gets it wrong. We always think, hey, I need to find this person that makes me happy or this person I have chemistry with. When we begin to live our life on mission and we just say, hey, I'm pointing to something beyond the sun, what happens is we begin to have these people that are on mission together with us. And we begin to see this, and we're pointed in the same trajectory. And when you begin to think about your life and you begin to say, how is it that I begin to make sure that I'm doing something that is most likely going to benefit me in the selection of my mate? I would say, don't rely on chemistry, because you're going to change. You're going to age. Your personality is going to change. And who knows if the person that you are when you're in your 20s is going to be the person that you are in your 50s. But if you have a trajectory towards something that's under the sun, that is going to be a connection point for the rest of your life. Not only that, just with your personhood, just you individually. When you have a purpose in your life, when you have something you're pointed towards, this is a beautiful thing because it pulls out passion like no other. When you begin to live your life with passion and direction, it revolutionizes what brings you joy in your life. Oftentimes we're looking for all these things. I think the thing that brings us the most joy is for us to be pointed somewhere with a purposeful life. And these are those things, when we begin to understand what this looks like, we see guys that have lived this out, actual stories. One of the stories that I love is a couple of guys, Jim Elliott, Nate Saint, were a part of a team of people that decided to point their lives to the jungles of Ecuador, and they located a group of people called the Aucas. And these are people who had never heard of the gospel, and these are people that evidently everybody wanted to make sure that they did not tangle with, because they were known for their ferocity. They were known for their decisions to kill people that got too close to them. They were a savage tribe of individuals. And what they did is they decided, hey, they need Jesus. They don't know Jesus. We have Jesus. We have to tell them about Jesus. And so they were a bunch of pilots, and they tried to figure out how do we make this work. So they would fly their plane in circles and drop down these buckets with gifts. And they began to kind of make contact with them. And they began to have gifts begin to be returned, and they took that as a great sign that they were open and willing to fuse a relationship and form a relationship with these four guys. And so finally the day came where they take and they locate a strip that's about 4 miles from the Auca village. And there's this, on this river, there's this kind of beach area, and they land their little plane there. And about 3 days later, when they haven't come back, they realized, the people back at camp realized that something had gone wrong. So they took another plane and they flew over right where those guys had landed. And as they flew over, they saw the plane whose wings and fuselage had been torn to shreds. And they saw the bodies of these men with spears in them in the river. And these men had decided that it was worth it, whatever risk it took for them to point their lives beyond the sun, to be able to bring the gospel to the Aucas. And ultimately, one of the daughters of one of the men that lost his life that day was able to become a missionary and embed herself for 40 years in this tribe. And this tribe is, the majority of them are incredible Christians. This is a part of their culture now. That this is a part of who they are. This is their reality, that these people know Jesus. Here's what Jim Elliott says. It says this: he is no fool who gives what he cannot keep to gain that which he cannot lose. In the face of saying, hey, this makes no sense. That wasn't successful at all. Why would you do that? He says this: it's not foolish when you give something that you cannot keep, to know that every single one of us, that there's a timeline that we are going to exit this world, that we cannot keep this, but what we can do is we can use it for something that affects eternity, to gain something that you could never lose. What a powerful, powerful thing. Another one of the guys in his journal, before that fateful day, he says this, a guy named Nate Saint. This is even more pointed. He says, and to those people who do not know why the Lord, or do not know the Lord ask why in the world we would waste our lives as missionaries. They forget that they too are expending their lives, and when the bubble has burst, they will have nothing of eternal significance to show for the years that they have wasted. These guys understood the story. They understood that they could live the cycle or they could live the story. That there's something that's beyond the sun that's worth their lives. And what is amazing with this is that they understood that God has not only put eternity in our hearts, but He has put eternity within our grasp by sending His Son, Jesus Christ, so that we might not just be hopeful for meaning, but we might be able to have a relationship with God through Jesus living the life that we should have lived and dying the death that we should have died, enabling us to be able to know our Heavenly Father and ultimately point our lives to Him as something that is beyond the sun. And Jesus says this in Mark 8:36. He says, what good is it for someone to gain the whole world and have all the success, right? And yet forfeit their soul. That we have to understand there's two things in play. So what does this look like? How does this actually play itself out? This is a massive thought. How do we point our life beyond the sun? Here's what Moses says. In Psalm 90, verse 12, he says this. He says, teach us to number our days that we may gain a heart of wisdom. Teach us to number our days that we may gain a heart of wisdom. How do we know? We number our days. What does that mean? That we understand that there's a finite amount of life and that we should take and figure out how to live our life towards a purpose. And now this is not what I'm saying for you to feel, I don't want you to feel like, oh man, I have to work all the time. I don't want you to feel guilty for sleeping and pooping and stuff like that, right? Stuff that you're not productive in, right? I want you to be able to say, hey, this is what I'm gonna do. You wrote down that number. And what I want to do is to call that out for us. My number, 14,610. Who knows if that'll be something that I actually get, but that's the estimate, right? That's the average. For me to point my life, 14,610 days. God's called me to work, to rest. But this is where I want to be able to point my life and say, here's what I can do. This is the why behind my life. We'll get to the what in the next couple of weeks. That God's called us to live a what, but here's what we need to understand, the why behind it all. And here's what I want to just press into us, for us to ask the question, are we living beyond the sun? Are we living under the sun? See, most of our life, we think we're here to get recognition. We're here to be remarkable. But Solomon says, here's what you need to understand. Your life here is to prepare for eternity. For you to be able to point beyond the sun with your life. And so let me ask you, are you pointing beyond the sun? Each and every one of us. Is that the why behind our life? This is what God's called us to do. And this is what I feel like God is calling our church to recognize. What does this look like for us?